everybody. How are you? My name is David Parsons, and this is another edition of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. Thank you so much for finding the show, tuning into it. I feel like there are a lot of people who are new to the show or who are listening to it for the first time. So I wanted to give a quick update about where the show is, where it's been, and what the whole thing is about. I started this show called the Nostalgia Trap in the wake of Occupy falling apart around 2013, 2014. I got into podcasting, and the Nostalgia Trap was conceived really, it's kind of embarrassing because I'm not a huge fan of this guy, but I kind of thought of it myself as doing kind of like a Mark Maron for the radical academic set, meaning I kind of wanted to interview the people who I met in graduate school, whether they be professors or fellow graduate students or people who were graduate students that are now professors, etc., and kind of get their take on how they became academics, but specifically how their work kind of reflects on the history of the left and how it might fit into a radical or left or Marxist perspective, however you want to construct that. So, I've done that, and I think this is going to be like episode 83, 84, somewhere in there. I've done a ton of episodes, and I've interviewed a lot of people, and that includes like quote unquote like famous academics like Eric Foner and Francis Fox Piven and people like that, but also people that are lesser known, academics who are in the trenches of teaching and doing research, but they all almost uniformly are people who are on the left, I would say. With a few exceptions, I like to talk to people outside of the academy. I like to talk to people who aren't necessarily leftists and Marxists and doctrinaire communists. I'm interested more as the show has gone on and expanded. I think we've done a lot to kind of consider what's happening in the world and how we as leftists kind of fit into it. And so those conversations I have been really valuable for me. I think I've learned a lot, and I think I've learned a lot from both the guests that I've talked to and the interactions I've had with people who listen to the show online. So, all of it's been a really, really satisfying project for me, and the Nostalgia Trap just keeps chugging along. I'm interviewing lots of people. We're doing the AM/FM episodes, which are kind of apocalyptic considerations of the end of the world, with a lot of sound clips thrown in to kind of add a little bit of texture and flavor to our conversations. So I hope you're enjoying all of that. And I've been lucky enough to have people contribute to the Patreon, and I'm asking those of you that are listening to the show and who value this kind of conversation, this kind of talk, these kinds of profiles of personalities that don't really get any play anywhere else in the quote-unquote mainstream media or wherever. You don't get to hear you don't get to hear long interviews with radical academics about their lives and their politics and their work. And I think that's what makes the Nostalgia Trap unique. So if that's valuable to you, please consider donating to the Patreon. That's at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Patreon is Patreon. And Patreon is just a platform that allows artists, podcasters, all sorts of people to get a little bit of money and support for their work. So you can become a Nostalgia Trap patron. I send out stickers and buttons every couple months to the people who are donating $5 or more a month. So if you want to subscribe to that, it would really help the show, and I appreciate that. Okay, so that is enough of that. My guest today is Yekaterina Oziashvili. She is a professor of political science at Sarah Lawrence College and someone who, like many of the guests on this program, went to the CUNY Graduate Center, where we weren't in the same department, but I think we knew a lot of the same people, and I always wanted to hear her life story. She is from the Soviet Union, and the collapse of the Soviet Union changed her and her family's life dramatically. They ended up in the United States, in New York City. And that story is, has a lot to do with politics and has a lot to do with the kind of things that we touch on this show a lot. So I had a really, really great time talking with her. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you enjoy all the Nostalgia Trap episodes. You can find them all for free at nostalgiatrap.com. And if you have it in your heart and your wallet to give a little bit of money to the show, that would be very much appreciated and would help the show continue. So please consider donating at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and enjoy this conversation. This is me talking with Yekaterina Oziashvili. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time because, you have I don't know. You have such a very particular take on politics that I see on social media, but also like I know that you're connected to Russia and the Soviet Union, not only in your studies but personally too. I mean, where are you from originally?
I'm from Georgia.
You're from Georgia. Yes.
Right. Not the South. Right.
No.
Yeah.
No. I think I understood that it was not the Georgia of the American South, but. Yeah. So, well, I mean, I don't know a whole lot. I'm not an expert on Russia by any means. I mean, for me, like the entryway into all that is because I study the Cold War. So I've got this very particular kind of like take on the American side of that. But you know, how long were you there in Georgia? How long did you stay there?
So, well, so in Soviet Union in general, I spent about 13 years, right? So at first I was born in Georgia, but after the Soviet Union collapsed and Georgia had a civil war and there's all these other problems, my parents sent us to Moscow to live with our grandparents, and we lived 3 years there, so in Russia. So both countries. And then in 96 we moved here. So from 81 to 96, I spent either Georgia or Russia, mostly Georgia.
Oh, so you were about 15 years old when you moved to the United States?
14.
14, wow. So, I mean, before we get to the big, like, you know, coming to America journey in the 90s, you know, what was your experience of the Soviet Union? I mean, it seems like you were kind of, if you're in Georgia, you weren't in the kind of like central part of it, right? You're like, Georgia's kind of one of the outlying, like, I mean, I feel like Georgia's a place that's filled with ethnic minorities. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, it kind of has an ethno-federal structure, so they have they have their own separatist movements, right? Into the Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Nigeria. So you know, there's a tiny country with a lot of different ethnically, it's territorially concentrated groups as well. Yeah.
So what was?
But Georgia was also, I mean.
Yeah, I was going to ask about your parents. Kind of like how did because I mean you were so young. I mean I'm someone who came late to politics, but it sounds like politics would have been somewhat more in your life when you were young.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean politics was, I mean pretty much my life when I was little was all about politics, right? Because everything was happening as I was, you know, in the 80s. And it's funny because only now I started, maybe I'll get to that point about how I took a Corey Robbins class, you know, you interviewed him twice in your podcast.
Yes.
And he made me rethink some of the ways that I thought about Soviet Union before. But I had a very rosy picture of the Soviet Union, and I think it's part because I was a child when I lived there, and, you know, childhood memories are always wonderful, right? Everything is beautiful and wonderful.
Right.
And because I was coming of age as the Soviet Union was collapsing, and my family, I think, was the only people I knew who were in a position to that collapse. I was growing up in a very kind of angry household and very panicky household, and I grew up to be a very angry teenager, an angry person as a result of that.
But, you find that a lot in academia, I think.
That's right, exactly. Yeah. Damaged people, right? Where do we go, academia? But you know, Georgia, I think, especially within the Soviet Union, was kind of this wonderful kind of place. It's warmer than Russia. People are very hospitable. Food is wonderful. I mean, it's great. I mean, you know, Tbilisi is a beautiful city and all these things. So I think it was a very nice place to grow up. And I think because of that, I had, in addition to the fact that I think Soviet Union had a lot of good things to, you know, going about it, I think I had a very good experience. And because the Soviet collapse also was such a kind of drastic difference, right? The whole country collapsed in a way that, you know, right now I think about it, I think it's you know, it's a science fiction, right? It can't be real. So it was so.
Well, how did you experience collapse?
Right. So the collapse for me was, I think, different from other people as well, because my family was the prototype of the Soviet family, right? My parents totally bought into this idea of the mixing of nationalities. My family did, right? So my father was half Georgian, half Russian. His mom's from Russia. He's back from Georgia. My mom was half Ukrainian Jew, half Tatar from Russia. So we spoke Russian at home, and everything was fine until the Soviet Union collapsed, and all this nationalist movement really became quite ugly. And it was going from Russian-speaking kid with a Georgian name in Georgia, and everything's fine, wonderful, to kids throwing stones at me and my sister in the street because they knew we were the kids who spoke Russian.
Wow.
I remember going to a doctor's checkup. I must have been around 7 then, and the doctor asked me something in Georgian, and I said, "I'm sorry, I don't speak Georgian." And she said, "Why don't you leave and go to Russia then?" She's very angry about it. So, there's a lot of this kind of ugly nationalism, and our family clearly didn't belong, right? So, in addition to that, I think this is the first time I saw a homeless person. I distinctly remember, it's funny, childhood memories are very much kind of these things when you think they're memories, but really it's just a segment of whatever, you stayed in your head and you have these images of them.
Right.
So my first image of a homeless person was in Georgia, and I was walking with my father, and we saw this guy begging on the street. I've never seen him before in my life. I thought it was the most horrifying thing ever. And my father was so embarrassed at the time, I remember, for the country in general, for us, for, having witnessed it. And he was horrified. I never saw my father so upset.
That's incredible. I mean, having lived in New York for so long, homelessness is just like a fact of life there, to the point where I kind of never got over it, in the sense of like just watching people step over people on the street and like explaining homelessness. I'm thinking about you in Georgia, like seeing a homeless person for the first time as a child. It's like explaining homelessness to a child is a really tricky thing, because it's like there's so much bound up with that.
Right. And again, I think my father was probably more confused than me, because that was also his first time to see a homeless person. So he didn't know how to explain it, except, my parents always talked politics at home. They never kind of hid anything from us. So I think he was just turned around and he said, "This is what I was telling you, everything is going to shit. See, this is what's happening."
Wow. Yeah. It was evidence of something. So, right. Yeah. So as that proceeds, it's funny because, watching from the United States, the story of the collapse of the Soviet Union is such a different story, because in the United States, it was greeted with kind of like, I don't know, it was like there was the collapse, or there was the fall of the Berlin Wall was seen as this kind of like just blank celebration of democracy. In other words, it was a very simplistic view from the U.S. And the kind of collapse of the Soviet Union was seen as this kind of like smug victory for the forces of democracy and capitalism. But it's seems like it's obviously so much more complicated story from inside. I don't know. That phrase ethno-nationalism is scary, because you see it a little bit rising in the United States. That kind of like, and in part, the United States has like a streak of that. How did you perceive that stuff? It sounds like your parents were kind of like, they weren't down with that. They weren't down with the ethno-nationalism, right?
Right. Well, my parents, I think it was, in a way, they have it easy to. First of all, I think ethno-nationalism is a terrible thing, and with respect to the Soviet Union, a lot of people, a lot of scholars talk about ethno-nationalism as a liberating kind of movement, because it was kind of anti-colonial in nature. Right. But, frankly, there was nothing good about it. People who lived there, there were all these, people were forced to kind of pick identity, right? They said, "Are you Georgian or are you Russian?" And I was neither Georgian nor Russian, and it was impossible for me to pick anything. And people kind of assigned these labels to you. So Georgians got really angry when they realized that I had a Georgian name. How dare you not speak Georgian? When we moved to Russia, they were like, it's funny, we lived in Russia for 3 years, and we made a lot of friends outside our building. We had this violent games. It was weird. But anyways, the kids told us once, no, don't go to this next building. It's very dangerous. And I was like, why? And they said, because Georgians live there. And I said, well, we're Georgians. And they laughed. They thought it was a joke. So they, we were neither Russians nor Georgians nor anything else. It was very difficult to be nationalist about it. We were Soviets, and that was pretty much it. So when you see the only identity you ever know and can identify with, right? Kind of destroyed, and there's no replacement for it. I think it's a very traumatizing thing. And it's very ugly, it's very destabilizing, ugly, and there's nothing democratic about it because nationalism by definition is exclusionary.
Right. I mean, and that's what I was thinking, is like, how did that make you feel as a child? I mean, it doesn't seem like you have like kind of the tools really to even understand where the animosity is coming from. Did you have a sense of like, why do people hate Georgians here?
Well, my father very clearly explained to us, right, this nationalism. I mean, the feeling, in part, Russians didn't know anything about Georgians. They had this idea that we lived in tents. And I think a lot of this idea came from the fact that we're in the middle of the Civil War.
Right.
But Georgians didn't like Russians because nationalist movement said that Russians were a colonial force. So there was, neither side trusted the other. It was understandable in a way. I mean, from the very beginning, I realized that it was very elite driven, because I saw people getting together quite well until the collapse happened.
Right. Did life so how did life change for you when you said you moved to Moscow?
I moved to Moscow, yeah. My parents stayed behind for a while because Dad was working. My mom, I think she quit her job at that point. I mean, there was no work, right? My parents were both engineers at obviously state firms in the Soviet Union,
right?
Right. And my very much refused to follow this privatization route when everybody else said, let's stop talking about politics, let's make money. My father and my mother both were very much opposed to this idea. So they weren't very good at, in terms of surviving in that new kind of raw capitalist system. But but my father still had some kind of part-time job here and there, so he stayed in Georgia, and we lived with the grandparents in Moscow.
Okay.
And I hated it. I hated Moscow so much. I remember thinking, people seemed so much ruder. The weather was cold. Did not like it.
Did you? I mean, were you thinking about politics at this point? Were you like thinking, well, this change happened in my life, and I now live in Moscow because, and my parents are now like struggling in this new kind of capitalist environment. How much was that like on the surface of your mind when you were this young?
At that point, I think I was already around 10, 11.
Yeah.
And 12, and so it wasn't too young to think about it. And I remember very specifically, I thought my life was over. And the reason I'm saying, I'm not saying it in a very dramatic way, kind of, I have no friends or something. No, I grew up on very Soviet literature, and I grew up in a very pro-communist household. It's funny because my parents were never members of the party. They opposed the party. They opposed everything, a lot of bureaucracy that, Soviet Union became, all that stuff. But they were true socialists, ideologically. And they brought us up in that with these ideas, right? So I will say a lot. I say, I was born a communist.
You're like the term "red diaper baby" comes up a lot on this show. It usually to describe American kids who are raised by left-leaning and radical communist sympathizing Americans, but you were like a true red diaper baby.
Right, exactly. So for me, it was different because it was easy for me, right? I thought I belonged. I was born in a socialist state, right? This is where I belong, and I was very happy about it. I remember as a child being very happy, thinking that my goal is to contribute to the building of communism. I remember very distinctly.
That's amazing.
So when the Soviet Union collapsed, I realized that the idea, this Fukuyama's idea by the end of history was, I wasn't familiar, obviously, with that article, but for me, this is what I thought about when
oh wow! So you felt like this was the collapse of the socialist dream and the communist dream that you'd been raised with.
That's right. Yeah,
wow.
And that was I completely did not want to live in anything else, and I thought I thought I was definitely wrong. I was born in the wrong time. I should have been born before the Russian Revolution, and fought for it and not be alive to witness the collapse of everything.
Wow, that's such a tragedy, like a tragic story. It's almost like it's kind of incredible to think about a child that young kind of identifying so powerfully with this particular revolutionary moment.
Yeah, I mean, so that's, for me, a lot of people say that for them, the formative years are their teenage years when they begin to read and think about these things. For me, the teenage year were kind of empty years. I didn't read. I didn't think about politics anymore. I became so disillusioned and so depressed. I had no friends. I had nobody to talk to. So that was kind of, that's shitty time.
You're bereft without the communist revolution. But what about all that? What about all that American pop culture? I mean, we're told here that the Russians demanded blue jeans and Billy Joel and Coca-Cola and all that, and that's supposed to that's why this revolution happened, is because you can't deny the power of American consumption and power and pop culture. Was that? I mean, how are you relate? Well, first of all, I guess I want to know, like, kind of as a child, if you're like a dedicated communist revolutionary child, you're ready to be a child soldier for Lenin. Like, how are you related to the United States at all? Are you thinking of the United States as a great enemy, as something that has to be vanquished, or how are you relating to the United States in your mind?
It's funny. At the time, I didn't think about the United States. We didn't talk about the United States. And as a matter of fact, my father's dad, my grandfather, was a movie director in Georgia, and my father told me this story that when he was participating in making one of the movies, and it was going to be anti-American, and he was told, it came from the higher ups all the way from this Stalin kind of level higher up, that he should not make a movie that is anti-American. So I think there wasn't a lot of movies that was anti-American necessarily at the time, and so we didn't think about it. The only way I thought about the United States, I thought about it from two perspectives. One, I read a lot about the Native Americans, right, and the reservations. As an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, I was very much upset about it.
Wow.
And I thought, the Native Americans should get their land back, and, Americans should just start off. That was one of it. The second one was the treatment of African Americans and, racism in the United States, and I was very upset about that. But I didn't think about the United States in any other way. I saw some American movies, like old American movies, where they.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Is like, what was the availability of American pop culture? Did you see? I mean, if you were a teenager in the early '90s, that was a pretty ripe moment for like. I don't know. I think of like music and the explosion of grunge out of Seattle and all that kind of stuff. And was that did that stuff touch you at all?
It's funny. My sister and I got, my family was poor at the time because, obviously, right, the new Russians that they want with money, my parents completely opposed this whole thing. So we didn't have a music player for a while, so we didn't have access to music. I didn't grow up with music, really. Mm-hmm. Movies, in the 80s, there were a lot of old American films, and we watched them, and they were wonderful. But then in the early 90s, they started showing this really shitty films like Rambo and the Fight for Right. And I did not watch them. I despised them. I hated them. Mm-hmm. And everybody around me loved them.
That's incredible.
Absolutely wonderful.
Those were such those movies are basically like super hyper muscular American nationalism. I mean, they're really like I think of them as propaganda for the American side of the Cold War, really.
Absolutely. And 1991, this is a time when at least in Russia at the time, they loved that stuff. They showed it, and
amazing.
people. I thought how humiliating, to watch this and disgusting, but people loved it for a while.
There's something something really deep about that. You're watching the Rambo because, when over here we were. I mean, if you had kind of a left perspective, you were horrified by those movies too. But you were horrified by kind of, the really gross patriotic attitudes in them and the really gross violence of it. But there's also, I think a big portion of populations, obviously, that don't care about the ideology behind the movie and just want to watch the films and enjoy them. There's something powerful about that.
Right.
It's kind of scary, actually.
Right. I think that all this violence and fighting was what was attracting people, because those kind of movies weren't very popular in the Soviet Union. They weren't there at all. Mm-hmm. So I think, it was flashy and fast. You didn't have to think.
Yep.
I always tell, one of my all-time favorite Soviet films is 17 Moments of Spring, right? And it's about this Soviet spy. As a matter of fact, this film was so popular that when it was on, apparently, crime rate went down because everybody's watching the film.
Wow.
But I love that. I love that movie, right? And I think it has like 7 parts to it. But what's interesting about it, I rewatched it now, and it's so slow, right? Most of it is just this spy sitting in his car, smoking a cigarette and thinking.
Yeah.
4 hours.
Amazing. Yeah, and that somehow doesn't capture attention in the same way that a Rambo movie was, I guess. But
yes.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, because that point you made about I don't know, reading about the treatment of Black people in America, reading about the treatment of Native Americans. I think those two stories, and it's come up on this show a bunch of times, because this show, in part, I want to talk to people about like how they got radicalized or whatever, and like. For
right.
Americans, especially, Americans that end up on the left, I hear that story again and again. Well, it was like the treatment of Black people and the genocide of Native Americans are both stories from American history that seem really important and seem like they reveal something really, really vital about the history of this nation. But also that they kind of give the lie to a lot of the ideology, American ideology. I mean, I guess I wanted to know, like, where did you find that information? I mean, were these books that were available to you? The reason I bring it up is because I've seen Russian propaganda from the Cold War, and it's something that they hit again and again about America in like the animation, like Russian animation. There's like this DVD of Russian animation that like from the 1950s, and they're really like, they show lynchings, they're really focused on like pointing out the hypocrisy of the American vision of freedom because Black people are treated so poorly. So it seems like you kind of were exposed to some of that. I guess I wanted to hear more about that, like where you found that stuff.
Right. I think my knowledge was very mainstream. I think a lot about slavery I found from okay, so that book, I actually, Uncle Tom's Cabin is in English, right? I read it in Russian,
wow.
Of course, right? So I read that. But there wasn't anything written by Russian writers that I remember that did anything about it. The American writers that I read,
that's kind of incredible, though.
Like Native Americans, it was Fenimore Cooper, actually, was the first thing I read about Native Americans, which has nothing to do, of course, with the genocide or anything.
No.
But it got me really excited to read more about it. And I read about a bunch of people, I think some of them are Germans, writing just novels about it. There was nothing particularly political about them. But I got really interested about it, and I kept asking what happened to Native Americans, and that's when I kind of began to find out what happened and was very, very angry about it.
Yeah.
So it didn't come from television or anything like that.
No, I was curious about that. That's kind of amazing, though, that it was like James Fenimore Cooper and like Uncle Tom's Cabin. These are like 19th century sources, but they were important. I think that there's something about the language of those writers that like young people especially can attach themselves to. But
right.
Yeah. What brings you to the United States in 1996? Why did you move here?
It's funny. My parents never wanted to move to the United States. Most of the immigration, a lot of immigration at the time, came from Soviet Union in the 80s and then early 90s, were from people who really wanted to move to the United States, who thought it was going to give them better opportunities, better life. My parents absolutely did not want to move to the United States. At the time, they were still very much ideologically opposed to it. Of course, then Russia and Georgia also stopped being kind of our ideological allies. But for us, we had no other choice. In Georgia, being such a mixed family, in Georgia at the time, it was impossible to survive with Russian only. It was very difficult. Plus, Georgia was very difficult to live in because, separatist movements and all that stuff. And then in Moscow, we couldn't get a legal status, even though we were supposed to get a legal status because my mother is from Russia. Her parents were living in Russia and they were from Russia. But whenever my mother went to apply, the bureaucrat who was supposed to sign the paperwork wouldn't meet with her. And then my mother kept going. And one day he jumped out of his office and screamed at my mother. And he said, "You want me to give you the right? You come here with your Georgian kids, and he wants me to sign the paperwork." And he was very angry about it.
Wow.
So we were kind of people with no country at that point. So my parents' friends or acquaintances, they happened to live in the United States. And they called my parents once and they said, "Do you want to come to the U.S.?" And my parents just laughed about it. And they said, "Well, we played this green card thing and we put your name in it and you won."
Wow.
We had no idea what green card was, what the lottery was about. But we packed our bags and within a month we were here.
Where did you land when you first came to the U.S.?
Went to the Bronx. Straight to the Bronx. Palm Parkway was when we.
Oh wow! So you're still in that region.
We're still in the Bronx. Yes.
Have you lived anywhere else? Have you lived in New York your whole life in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I lived for about a year in Metuchen, in Jersey. Does that count?
No, I don't think that counts.
No, and I went back to Russia to do my field work for a year, but other than that, it was New York.
Yeah, so I don't know. New York is such a different city than any other place in America, and it's like it has this reputation as this like international place, et cetera, but like do you feel like how was it coming to New York when you were young? What was that like? Did you even want to be here?
I did not want to be here. I in a way I wanted to come here more than my parents did. Because I felt like, I hated Russia. I hated living there. I hated everything about it. Everybody talked about money only, how to make money. And I just couldn't deal with that anymore. Right? And I thought the United States might be something, yes, it's capitalist, but so is everything else, and might be different. And we came here, and I thought, oh my goodness, how ugly it is. And then a friend of ours was like, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'll show you Manhattan." And he drove us through Manhattan, and I was horrified because I would see all these wealthy stores and then homeless people sitting right next to them,
Yep.
And I thought that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen in my life. So much homelessness amongst so much plenty.
Yeah. That was always. I mean, and this is funny because I did not come from Russia. I came from California, but I came from this kind of like sunny suburban surf town in California that is very, very, very different from New York in terms of the number of people, et cetera, et cetera. But like what you're talking about, like seeing the jarring inequality on the streets of New York and the kind of like scale of it was honestly for me and the group of friends that I moved out to New York with when I was in my early 20s. It was we couldn't get over it for like years. It's all we talked about. We're just kind of like amazed by the fact that like there were. I mean, the kind of memory that I remember the most is my roommate coming home from working at a restaurant, like a nice restaurant on the Upper West Side. He got a good job, like waiting tables up there. And he said that there was a guy outside this like cafe where people were eating like tremendously expensive brunch meals. And there's a guy that was basically like naked or in his underwear with a sign that just said "hungry," and he was screaming at these people. And he came home like quite disturbed, being like, "What kind of world do we live in?" kind of thing. And I mean, for New Yorkers, that's just stuff that just becomes like that's part of like developing a New York attitude is developing a like I don't care about that or I can't do anything. I don't see it, and it's like it's kind of horrible.
Yeah, you become desensitized to it. Now I walk through New York, and of course we all hate it, right? But I don't lose sleep over it. I go back. I mean, I think about politics.
Of course, we all hate it. Yeah. So you did you go to public school in New York, like high school?
Yes, I went to Beacon High School. I mean, at first, when we came here, we were very lucky. There was a school opened right next to where we lived in the Bronx. It was called High School of World Cultures. I don't know what happened to it, but it was only for 1 year. And they basically took all the kids, different age groups, and put them in the school for 1 year to get them to kind of study in English. So basically it's always very much ESL kind of thing.
Yeah.
And after that, we went to Beacon High School, which is right by Lincoln Center in Manhattan. So commuting there.
Okay. Yeah.
Definitely public school.
At Baruch, where I was for many years, they had like this accent reduction workshops where you could like the students could go and like learn to see like I guess like an American newscaster.
Proper American.
Yeah. I mean, how that sounds a little bit like what that cultural school you went to was almost like a school that was training you to kind of be American in one way or another. I mean, was that something that like did you feel that transformation happening, and were you angry about it?
No, actually, I love that school. I mean, so I remember we came to U.S. in May, right after we school in Russia finished, and I remember looking at the sky, and whenever I would see an airplane, I remember the feeling of this jealousy because these people were flying somewhere away from here.
Wow.
And I remember the smell, for a while, the smell of spring, because it's May, was haunting me, because I hated that smell because it was associated with New York.
Yeah.
But then the school started, and all these kids, none of them spoke any English. And it was, it was fine, they didn't try to teach us much, really. It was just a space for kids who had no English or very English to come together and try to communicate somehow.
Right.
And it kind of helped me through this first year. I think it was fine. It was good. I mean,
so it was a positive. Oh, you did not work on accents.
No, they did not. I mean, they worked on things like this is how you say subway. Yeah.
So did your life change when you came to America? I mean, it sounds like you're describing being in Moscow, being like sullen,
hated Moscow.
Yeah, disappointed that the communist revolution was had hit a significant speed bump. At what point do you begin to like America? Do you begin to like New York? I mean, you're still there. It's been a long time.
Yeah, right. No, so the teenage years, I hated everything about it. I hated the world, period, right? I thought this is, it's not that I thought New York was any worse than anything else. I thought everything has gone to hell, and there was no meaning in life anymore. Like I said, I stopped reading. I mean, what's the point of reading? You go to the library. I had no friends to guide me to what books to read in English. You pick a book, you sit with a dictionary and spend an hour reading a page, it was...
Oh, God.
And I had no friends whatsoever. I felt so lonely. Even I had identical twin sister, so I wasn't as lonely as some kids would be. But it was just the two of us. And then I went to college, and I think college changed it.
Where did you go?
I went to Barnard.
Barnard, okay.
I did not leave New York at all. In part by design. My mother said, you're going to apply to schools in New York City and, to be close to home, and that's what we did. And went to Barnard, and that's when I started meeting professors who would talk about politics and kind of mention socialist, or at least, more or less left-leaning views. And I thought, oh, wow, this is still acceptable. This is still okay. Right. And I think that kind of gave me life.
That's amazing. Yeah, and it's funny because we talk a lot about on this show about like the experience of college and how it changes you, and many of us, and I include myself, like I had the experience of like discovering left-wing politics in college. Like I had never even, I mean, I knew they existed, but I kind of thought of the left wing as like liberals. You know what I mean? Like liberals were as far as it went, because American media like really gives the idea like that liberals are basically the American left. And
the left, that's right.
Right. And so but it sounds like it was different for you. Like you actually kind of rediscovered politics through seeing that American professors, and I guess non-American professors, some too, I'm sure, that are talking about that stuff.
I'm embarrassed to say, though, that I came to understanding the difference between liberals and leftists later than you. So, it's funny. In a way, I made this kind of circle, and maybe I'm a very late study or something. It takes me forever to understand things. I get very confused, but, I was born a communist. I became apolitical in the teen years because I realized that the dream is over and now it's all capitalism, so what's the point?
Right.
And nobody cares about politics anyway. I went to college and realized that politics is still alive. Fukuyama is not right. This is not the end of history.
Right.
History is still taking place.
Yep.
But I confused liberalism with leftism because liberalism is so easy.
Yeah.
It's so easy to be a fucking liberal, right? You can look at somebody and say, oh, isn't it unfortunate how black people are treated? Oh, you shouldn't eat meat, and it makes you a bad person. And that's, and that's it, right? You don't have to do anything about it.
Yeah.
There are no structural things, and and you feel good about yourself afterwards, right?
Yes. Well, you saw how excited people were about Oprah the other day, and I feel like
God.
that's exactly what you're talking about, though. Like that feeling of like
exactly
she makes you feel good about like being an American, and like makes you feel good about like being a person that's engaged in justice in some vague way. And it's like it's really
that's right.
It's weird. She's like I don't know. She's like kind of a religious figure in some ways because she doesn't really say anything of substance, but there's this kind of constant message of self-affirmation, and the fact that people love her so much tells you a lot about the liberal imagination, probably.
The lack of, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, yeah.
So
go ahead. But I totally bought into it, right? I watched Jon Stewart and Colbert Report, and I laughed, and I thought they were funny.
Oh yeah.
And
and are you talking about like this is like the Bush years, basically, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it was, and I think that's the danger sometimes of having like this like the Republican president, because like all of a sudden there's this industry born of people that just like express their outrage all the time, and sometimes do it in clever and funny ways. I was with you with the Colbert and Stewart stuff. I mean, for a while during the Bush years, they were like the only voice in the mainstream culture that were like saying shit about those guys. So it's like it's totally understandable to like feel like that was the left at that point, but that's kind of depressing.
Yeah, it is, right? I mean, in a way, I'm very grateful for the Bush years for me personally, right? Because this allowed me to get back into kind of political mindset, right? And feel bad about something and feel like, I want to be on the right side, that is the left side, once again. And there are people there with me. I'm not alone anymore, Yep. And liberalism was the easiest way to get there. So, I went to the anti-war protest. Actually, my father took me to the very first anti-war protest.
And you're talking about the Iraq War?
Iraq War, that's right.
Yep.
Yeah. And it was very exciting for me. I mean, in a way, I was very happy. I mean, it was the first time I was happy in a very long time, since I think I was like 10 or 11. I
felt that way too.
Way.
It was a moment. It was a moment to like feel like I don't know. Was this in New York where you went with like millions of people on the street? Yeah, that was a great moment. It felt like. Yeah. I mean, that's the one. I mean, I'm not a big street protest person, but the one thing I always get out of it is like when you're on the streets doing that thing and seeing people that feel the same way as you is like really a very kind of strengthening and positive experience.
That's right, exactly. Of course, as you move more to the left, right, you realize that they don't actually think the same way as you, and you become more skeptical about it.
Yeah.
But
well, you weren't to that layer of pessimism yet. It doesn't sound like.
Not yet, right? Or I would think a layer of optimism.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, you're right. So, how did you move through that? I mean, it sounds like you were in college at Barnard, like during the Bush years, and then moved on to. I mean, when I first encountered you, it was at the CUNY Graduate Center, and you were, I think, working on a PhD in political science. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
So how did you get there from Barnard?
That's a good question. So college and kind of, life in college gave me, as I said, life, right? In a way, I realized that, life is not meaningful. I focus and engage in political conversations and how fantastic. And then I realized that I'm graduating. And other kids, when they graduate, they look forward to, going back and, meeting their high school friends or, starting something. And I had no friends from high school. And I had no goals in life. I mean, I didn't want to have a job. I knew that. I didn't want to work 9 to 5. Well, 9 to 5 jobs don't exist, right? But I didn't want to work a meaningless fucking job, right? I mean, so I thought, how can you kick me out of college? I want to be in college forever.
Yeah.
And so that's when I decided to apply to graduate school. I said, and people said, maybe you should try master's. I said, why? I'm going for a PhD, and I never want to graduate.
Yeah, no, that's
so
great.
I spent 8 years getting a PhD because I didn't want to get out.
I was there. I was there for a long, long time too, and part of me, I mean, I did not get a full-time job. I still haven't. We'll see. If anyone listening to the show has a full-time job for me, let me know. But I'm still like doing the adjunct thing and everything, and I think all the time about like. I tell Claudia, I'm like, maybe I should get another PhD and be that guy that like just has several PhDs and spends his whole life in the academy.
I considered that too, actually. Yeah, I want to be that person.
There's something very appealing about it. What, did you study politics at Barnard? Is that what your major was?
I did a double major in economics and politics. Politics wasn't fun in Barnard for me. There was nothing. I don't remember taking too many classes that were. I chose my classes wrong. Let's just say I had no idea who to take, what class to take. Right, so I took things like American presidency and was uninspiring.
Yeah, it sounds
economics
uninspiring.
Economics classes were actually more fun because there were some Lefty people teaching them, so that was fun. But I knew nothing about politics until I started, or political science. Right, until I started graduate school, really.
That's kind of amazing. So you like applied for a PhD program for a discipline that you didn't know a whole lot about.
Right, but I think that's pretty much what everybody does, right?
Yep.
I mean, college is not there to teach you discipline. College is there for you to kind of teach you how to think for yourself. And then, discipline is taught at graduate school, really.
So it
for
was
good and bad.
Was it at the Graduate Center that you took classes with Corey Robin?
Yes. Well, I took one class with him. He only took one APD class. And this is where I realized, after a while, to my horror, that he told me that's when he was working on his book on conservatism, I guess, and we're reading a lot about American conservatives and what it means to be conservative. And I started thinking a lot of my very positive feelings about Soviet Union. I mean, a lot of them were because I'm a communist, therefore, of course I have positive feelings about that one model that failed, but, was one hope in a way.
Right.
But part of it was just this conservative desire for some greatness and stability. And, I was, as a child, I was a big fan of Soviet literature. Nobody reads Soviet literature, of course, right? They didn't before and they won't again, but it was wonderful. I'm going to teach him. I'm going to make him read all the books that I read. Because I think they formed me into a human being, and a lot of it's just propaganda, but that's fine, I mean, there's propaganda everywhere.
Yeah, what's not propaganda, really?
Right, exactly. But my attachment to those books and to what I thought was the Soviet Union, I think in part was conservative. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to sound all self-critical, the kind of, Maoist way, but there was something about my attachment that wasn't leftist, but rather conservative.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that before.
I'm trying to get rid of that part.
They kind of can you talk a little bit more about that? Because there's this phrase, this word you've probably heard, tanky, on the left, right?
Right.
And a tanky is someone who apologizes for the Soviet Union all the time, and is basically in the bag 100% for the old school 1917 project. I mean, do you see that tanky impulse as a conservative one, or it has elements of it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And in my teens, I absolutely admit, in my teens, I was a tanky.
That sounds like the name of a memoir. Yeah. In my teens, I was a tanky. Yeah.
Right. In a way, it was a defensive kind of stance, right? I mean, it wasn't. I would have been anti-tanky if the Soviet Union were to persist. But as it was falling apart, I was trying to defend everything about it. And I don't think it was very productive in a way. But neither is, kicking it and saying, well, just a failed model and forget it, let's not talk about it anymore, how nonsensical, and let's, shit all over the Russian Revolution. I don't believe in that either. I think that is also a very conservative kind of reactionary, rather.
Well, yeah. I mean, did you see this recent Jacobin article? I didn't read it, but I saw the headline.
I didn't read it either.
I saw the kerfluffle about it.
I can't make myself read it.
But it's basically the gist of it is like forget about 1917 and we need to move on and think about like Abraham Lincoln as a communist figure and think about. I think that the gist of it is like we need to like move on towards like looking towards like 1970s democratic socialism in Sweden and that kind of stuff. But it's
right.
I mean, I read that as just like straight like anti-communism almost.
Absolutely, I mean it is right. It's funny because even first of all, that kind of model is a non. It's a failed model, right? I mean, people who were more or less liberal, like Street, right, who's more to the left, already criticized that model, right? It's not sustainable. So it's to say that somehow the Swedish model is more realistic as a model than something more revolutionary is nonsense.
Yeah, no, I agree, and for me the larger thing for me is like I don't know, people talk about you see like the conservatives in America like to talk about how many people communism killed. They're always like, communism killed millions and all that kind of stuff. And that's what I felt like when I saw that headline. I felt this kind of like anti-communism is an ideology too, and anti-communism killed millions too. I mean, anti-communism is an ideology that has a significant body count. And so when I hear people that are like kind of heading towards talking about communism and talking about revolutionaries in that way, especially people like Jacobin who ostensibly are like on the left, it's really disappointing.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I mean, I feel it's a big word, right? Betrayed, but in a way, right? Yeah. Betrayed by the magazine whose job is not to kind of shit all over, things that the left is attached to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's plenty of other spaces to do this, right? Why give space to do it in Jacobin as well? Yeah,
it's a weird organization. They've come up a few times on the. So you did end up finishing your PhD though, right? Like you got out. You're not a graduate student anymore.
I got out. That's right. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I was. My daughter made me and James both got out because we had a baby perhaps earlier than we should have. I don't know. So I was pregnant and I decided to schedule my defense. And I defended 6 weeks after I had Emma.
That's amazing.
So, that was interesting.
And are you?
Yeah, I felt like a pumpkin.
Are you raising a red diaper baby over there?
Absolutely. Emma absolutely can. She sings the International in Russian, so she's all there. Yeah.
So you speak Russian to her?
Yes, she speaks Russian and English. I mean,
that's amazing.
I'm also lucky to have my parents living nearby, so they speak also Russian to her.
Well, I mean, there's this the incident you had a couple weeks ago. I remember I saw you and James talking about it on Facebook, where Emma like refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance in class.
So she doesn't refuse to say it, but she refuses to stand up.
Okay.
So she's the only kid in class who sits through the pledge and the
so she's like kneeling like a football player, basically. She's like
basically
she's showing respect.
I mean,
Wow.
It's funny, right? Because I mean, technically, we kind of suggested to her that she should do neither. That it's not, she shouldn't sing it, she shouldn't say it, and she just sit there and sing the International, right? But look, she's 5. right?
Yeah.
I don't expect her to do this. And, she says to me sometimes, she's like, the Star Spangled Map, the national anthem, she says this song is catchy, so I like to sing it. And I say, well, it is catchy, right? So go ahead, fine. If you feel like it, I'm not going to tell you not to. But yeah, she proceeds to sit down, which used to be fine until this substitute teacher came in and questioned her for not standing up, and questioned where she was from, where her father was from, and all these things.
Oh, wow. That's that's not cool behavior on the part of the substitute teacher for sure. I was just kind of amazed because I don't have a child, and me and Claudia, we're both pretty radical, and we think about this stuff all the time, and it seems kind of like really hard to raise a child, as a radical left person in the environment of the United States, like in the social and political environment of the United States. That seems really hard.
Yes.
Those are like I don't know what's right on a lot of those decisions.
I think in part it's harder. I mean, if we lived in a very conservative area, I think it would have been easier, right? Because it's much easier to kind of rebel against conservatism, right? We know statistically, right, that children of conservative parents are more likely to move to the left. But it's not as easy to rebel against liberalism, right? Because it seems so nice and kind, and how does it make you feel kind of thing, right? Kumbaya, let's hold hands, and all that shit, right? So for children especially, what's wrong with it, right? And how do you explain to them what's wrong with liberalism?
That's a really great point. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's totally what's going on with like liberal Democrats right now. It's really easy to shit on Trump. It's really easy to point out how shitty conservatives are. It's a little trickier to attack liberalism because liberalism has this smiling face. And like, if you're sitting there saying, well, Barack Obama is actually, an imperialist asshole, people are like really genuinely like their feelings are hurt when you say that. They're like,
that's right.
They're like, this guy's my friend. Like, I want him to come over and have dinner with us. And like, he's such a wonderful figure in the way he speaks and the way the vision he puts out. So liberalism is kind of like, the face of capitalism right now, and it's a nice face, and it's hard. It's very. You're right. I think that's a really great point. It's very hard to kind of how do you attack the nice face of liberalism without seeming like you're being some sort of curmudgeon or disruptive to people's happiness and sense that they're good people. God. That's
right. Yeah, don't you just want everybody to get along? And that's what Emma said to me once, something about, people just want to get along. And I said, no, people shouldn't get along. Okay, there's going to be conflict, and conflict is a good thing. But, again, it's tricky to explain to 5-year-olds without giving her kind of false ideas. No, I don't want you to start going around beating people in the head or anything like that.
Right. But at the same time, I mean, it seems like, you have an experience going back to your childhood where, you were able to engage with pretty complicated ideas, at a young age. And it seems like that I mean, if there's one thing you can do with kids, it's talk to them. I don't know how deep the politics will go with a 5-year-old, but I don't know. They have some. I feel like they've got to have some innate sense.
No, I think it's funny because I think my parents are no longer on the left, but when I was little, and I think it's part of why I became a socialist because of parents. My father explained to me, talked to me about communism very early on when I asked him about. I think I was about 5 years old when I asked him about the difference between socialism and communism, and he said something about how imagine people working in the factory, everybody making getting paid the same thing, but then for what they make, but then there's one guy who only has one leg and he can't make as much as other people. Is it fair that he's going to make less money because he's less able to do, the work? And I said, well, of course it's completely unjust. And he said, well, that's why communism is, the right kind of way forward, right? Because people will get according to their needs. Right, not according to what they're contributing.
Right.
And I thought, and I was 5, and children understand. People just don't understand what's fair and what's not. Right?
Sure.
Children have very strong ideas about it. So I think I was, I still remember it. I still remember the conversation, and I think that's something that you can't take away from me. I mean, I'm not going to be one of the people who's going to turn 80 and be like, well, now I'm wise, I'm a conservative. I mean, come on, unless you erase our memories.
You don't seem, of all the people that I think, that could happen to, you don't seem like one of those people that's going to have that late in life reversal to conservatism. It's funny because you can almost, that's a true thing. And I talked to so many leftists on this show that like they saw people on the left turn that way as they got older, and it's like it's almost a cliche, right? But you don't strike me as one of those people. The Jacobin people, definitely, but you feel like someone who's a little more committed. Kat, thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thanks, Dave.
I had a good time. I'll talk to you soon. Okay, I want to give a big thank you to my guest, Yekaterina Oziashvili. I had a really great time talking with her, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation. You can find more Nostalgia Trap stuff at nostalgiatrap.com. Follow me on Twitter at David L. Parsons. Find me on Facebook, etc., etc. I love talking with you guys about this stuff, and thanks for supporting the show. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. You've heard from me enough. Have a great week, and I will talk to you again soon.